Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about eyeshadow, and specifically I want to talk about eyeshadow palettes, and more specifically I want to talk about neutral eyeshadow palettes. The idea of neutral eyeshadow palettes is very important to me because it introduces my journey into makeup. So if you've been following my channel, you know that I didn't change my makeup for over a decade. I wore the same makeup, the same powder foundation, no concealer, nothing for a really, really long time. And I woke up in my 40s and I realized, gosh, this is not working. I feel like I aged 10 years in a day and I needed to change some things. When I started looking into makeup and watching YouTube, first and foremost, I was totally overwhelmed by the amount of information on there. But I started watching YouTube videos. I found a few women that I felt comfortable with that were my age group, who weren't doing crazy things with makeup that I just wasn't going to achieve or was interested in. And I also got a makeup lesson, and one of the recommendations I got was find a good neutral eyeshadow palette. I apologize, this is Freddie Forcefield over here. He has decided he wanted to be part of this video, so he's hanging out over here. So I apologize if he's distracting. He's having a very rough day. You know, it's very exhausting having to be a cat. So anyway, as I was saying, one of the best advice I got was find a good neutral eyeshadow palette. And I went looking and I ended up buying a few, and I learned some things along the way, and I've now tried countless eyeshadow palettes. So I wanted to pick my top 5 neutral eyeshadow palettes. They range from high-end to more affordable or drugstore. And I just think if you're like me and you're looking for a good neutral palette that can go from everyday and maybe even go to night, these are good places to start. These are great formulas and they're user-friendly, which I think is important. A history of neutral eyeshadow palettes, I think it's important to kind of break everything down a little bit and talk about the Naked palette. So years and years ago, actually in 2010, the Naked palette was launched by Urban Decay. This was one of the first true only neutral palettes that existed, and it kind of broke everything. You know, every brand followed suit. And so now we have so many different neutral palettes. What I think is really interesting about the original Naked palette is I recently saw an interview with one of the co-founders of Urban Decay, and she talked about the fact that, you know, Urban Decay is known for its very bright colors, very kind of punk rock look. But she said, you know, when you're using eyeshadow, whether you're making a purple look or a blue look, you have some workhorses. You have some shades that are meant to ground your look and make it look, you know, put together. And so she asked her team to bring in all their workhorses, all their shades that they use to kind of ground these different looks. And they all put them out on a table, and that's how the original neutral Naked palette was born. Well, the original Naked palette was discontinued in 2018, but you know, there have been many flankers. You know, there's been Naked 2, Naked 3, Naked Reloaded, and then of course the Naked palettes that have come out since then are not neutral per se. There's Naked Cherry and Naked Honey and Naked Ultraviolet, all of those. So that palette kind of started this huge trend. I'm not in any way implying there was never neutral palettes before the Naked palette, but it just changed everything. Now, full disclaimer, I don't have a Naked palette as part of my top 5 that I'm going to talk about today, because I do own Naked palettes, but I don't own any of the neutral ones. I own, I think, Naked Cherry, Naked Heat, and Naked Honey, which is actually my favorite, but I don't consider them neutrals. They're definitely more pink and purple, or honey is, you know, golds and stuff like that. So I don't think of them as neutral. So full disclaimer, they're not in this video, but I think if I'm going to talk about neutral palettes, I think I would be remiss not to talk about the history of the Naked palette, because I think that just kind of started this huge trend that's been going on for over a decade at this point. So the first in my top 5, the first neutral palette I want to talk about is from Tarte. So I love Tarte's eyeshadow formula, and the reason I love it is that it's really good for beginners. The Tarte eyeshadow formula is not patchy or chalky, but it's not crazy pigmented. And I like that because really pigmented eyeshadows, if you're a beginner, can be really hard to use. It's very easy to make a mistake and it's very hard to correct. So having something that you have to build a little bit more is gonna make your life a lot easier if you're just starting out using eyeshadow in this way. But that's why I like about Tarte's formula. My favorite Tarte palette, there's a few, but I'm gonna talk about the first Tartlet. This is an all matte palette. And then the second palette, which is actually my favorite, is Tartlet in Bloom. This is a mixture of matte and shimmers. I'm gonna show you mine quickly, but I'm gonna put one up on the screen because unfortunately my Tartlet in Bloom palette fell on the bathroom floor and shattered and all the eyeshadows popped out. I was able to put them back in. 2 of them completely shattered. And when I put them back in, they are not in the right order. They are just anywhere I would put them. I didn't check to see which shade went where. I keep talking about rebuying this palette. I just keep waiting for it to be on sale so I can rebuy it because I do love it. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous palette. The last in that group, the third Tartlet, which is Tartlet Toasted. If you like more warm tones in your neutral eyeshadow, that's a really good one to look at as well because it's still a neutral palette, but it's definitely more warm toned than it is where I think Tartlet and Tartlet in Bloom are kind of more neutral to more cool tone. Just 2 cents there. The next palette I want to talk about is a drugstore palette. It's my favorite at the drugstore. This is from Maybelline. This is the Nudes of New York palette. So if we open it up, this is definitely more warm toned as a whole, but this is also a gorgeous, gorgeous palette. It has everything you need in here and same rules apply. This reminds me a little bit of the Tarte formula in that it's not patchy or chalky, but it's not super creamy. It doesn't crumble in your hands and it's not crazy pigmented where you're gonna make a mistake easily and quickly. So I think it's a really, really good palette. It's definitely the right price. I think I bought this, I think it was $14 and I think I ended up getting it for $12 because I had a coupon at Kroger or something. But this is a great palette if you're looking for good quality at a drugstore price. There's nothing wrong with this formula. I think where you lose out in the drugstore is packaging. Obviously this is kind of more plasticky, not as pretty, but who cares if the formula is right? So that's a really, really good option. The next palette that I want to talk about in my top 5, this is probably, in my opinion, I think of this as a neutral palette for mature women. This palette is so easy to work with. The shimmers are very fine. So, even if you have really textured lids, these are gonna go well for you. And this is from Persona. And this is the Identity palette. There are 2 Identity palettes. This is the first of the 2. But you can see this is just a gorgeous, gorgeous neutral palette. It is a mix of mattes and shimmers, but these shimmers are so fine and creamy. You can see how beautiful that is. No chunks of glitter in here, nothing that's gonna get in your eye and make you feel like you're gouging out your own cornea. But yeah, like this is Bombshell. You can see, gosh, look how pigmented that is. And this is Seductive. These are just beautiful. This is such a wonderful palette. I highly recommend. I bought mine at Ulta, but I had to get it online because it's not sold in all Ulta stores. So I ended up buying mine on Ulta online. I believe it was about $42. I will put all the costs below for all these palettes as well. My next palette is again another affordable palette. I say affordable, I can call it drugstore, but there's a lot of argument about whether this brand should be called drugstore because you can't walk into a drugstore like Walgreens or CVS and buy it. You need to end up going to Ulta or buy it online. But the reason why I refer to it as a drugstore or affordable palette is because of the price. This palette is the same price as if you were to walk in to a Walgreens or a CVS. This is from ColourPop and this is their Going Coconuts palette. This is such a beautiful palette, you guys. Now, this formula is much more creamy and pigmented in comparison to the Tarte formula. So if you're a beginner, it can take a little bit to get used to, but it is such a beautiful formula. No patchiness, easy to blend out. I would say my one critique of ColourPop is that some of their shimmers are definitely more chunky, and they do have a lot of pressed glitter. So in their palettes, you'll usually find at least one pressed glitter. I'm not a huge fan of pressed glitter, so there's usually at least one shade I can't use. But we're talking about a palette that's $14, and if there's a single shade that I'm not going to use, that's fine with me. The other beautiful thing about ColourPop is no matter what color story you're looking for, ColourPop is going to have it. They have so many different eyeshadow palettes, and honestly, that's kind of the other critique. A lot of people think that ColourPop just launches and launches and launches, and maybe they launch too much, but there's definitely something for everyone with ColourPop. I'm a big fan of it, and Going Coconuts is my favorite. Going Coconuts is more warm toned. If you're looking for a more cool toned neutral palette from ColourPop, my favorite actually launched in the fall. It's called That's Taupe. I really like that palette as well. I actually used to own it. I gave it to a friend of mine who's more into more cool tones, where I tend to gravitate towards the warm tones. So the Going Coconuts is my favorite in that line. But you can't go wrong with ColourPop. Great formula, a little bit more pigmented, but still very friendly in regards to formula. The last neutral eyeshadow palette in my top 5 is from Too Faced. This is the Chocolate Bar palette. Now there are many in this series. I think there's a chocolate gold, there's a chocolate bonbon, and there may be a few others. But this is just a really, really beautiful neutral eyeshadow palette. It has a few pops of colors in there. It has a gorgeous, brow bone highlight or inner corner highlight. And you can see my favorite lip color is this one called Marzipan here. I've hit pan on that. Now, the thing about Too Faced is that, they scent everything. So there is cocoa powder infused into this eyeshadow formula. So when you open it, you will smell the cocoa. That's the whole thing. And that's just the story of Too Faced. Everything smells, whether it smells like peaches or apricot or banana or chocolate. If you are not into that, if you don't like any fragrance in your makeup, then just stay away from Too Faced in general. But if you're like me, who doesn't really like fragrance in skincare, but is not as worried about it in makeup, then this may be a good brand to try. This is a gorgeous eyeshadow palette. The formula is very easy to work with, a little bit more pigmented than the Tarte, but still a really, really nice formula in general. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed watching my top 5 neutral eyeshadow palettes. I would love to hear your comments below. Are any of these palettes on your top 5? Do you have other palettes? Do you think it was a travesty that I didn't include certain formulas or certain brands? Because everyone's got their own. It's funny, my absolute favorite eyeshadow formula is actually not on this list, and the reason is because I just don't think of those palettes as neutrals, and that would be Anastasia Beverly Hills or ABH. I absolutely love that eyeshadow formula, but when I look at those palettes, whether it be Soft Glam or Modern Renaissance, for example, I don't think of them as neutrals. I think of them as kind of the next step from a neutral. Now, some people would absolutely disagree with me, but that's just kind of the criteria that I randomly, subjectively came up with. I hope you subscribe below, and I hope to see you again in my next video. Bye, you guys.